So let's dive right into it. Now I've gone ahead and set up a new graph with my template that I've created in a different video. So make sure to check that out in the link below. And once we've got that set up, I'm just going to right click, drag and drop. Now the first order of business that I want to go ahead and start dealing with is going to be the larger variations of the cracks and just kind of the larger flow and structure for some of that larger detail. Now the way I want to go about that is I'm going to use just a random procedural noise. And we're going to use the cells 4 node for that. So I'll start to type in cells 4, and you can see that it's just going to give us these kind of Voronoi different colored cells here. And this is going to be perfect for what we want to do. So I'll plug that into my normal and my height, and we can see that it's going to show up perfectly. Now, this doesn't really look like cracks per se. And it might be kind of hard to tell where I'm going to be going with this, but trust me that in the next few steps, we're going to really start to see the crack-like structure of it. But first, let's go and bring this down to a more reasonable scale. So I'm going to bring it down to something like 4-ish. A little too far. There we go. So we're going to get a lot larger noise, and hopefully you can kind of see right where we're maybe going to start getting some of these cracks. But we're going to do a little bit more warping to it because it's very geometric and we don't want something as sharp. Now, maybe for whatever you're doing, you might, but technically or typically, I should say, you're probably not going to want that. So let's add a warp node. And I'm going to use my favorite node, the Gaussian noise, just because it's really good for some randomness. And now the overall scale for this is pretty intense. So let's go ahead and bring that down. And I want to do around, probably around 12 or 13 there, just so that we're getting some larger scale warping and skewing there, nothing too crazy. And we can also play around with the disorder if we don't really get a seed that we like too much. And yeah, that looks okay. So now when is this going to start looking like cracks, right? Well, we can do that pretty easily by just using one particular node. And that node is going to be an edge detect node. And you can see that here it's just going to detect pretty much any kind of contrast variation in our input image here. So areas where we're getting these cells intersecting with one another is going to be an area where we're going to be able to detect an edge. And so this is a really, really powerful node, and kind of just in 3 or 4 nodes here, pretty powerful setup or network, which is going to get you going with a lot of stuff. You've probably also kind of maybe recognized this pattern as a lot of people use it as kind of like the water caustics or the water foam for more stylized shaders in games and stuff. And really, all they're really doing is using a cells 4, or in most other applications, it's called Voronoi image, and then finding just kind of the boundaries of those particular cells. So why break from that mold, right? We're going to do pretty much the exact same thing. Now, if that's all you want, feel free to skip ahead to the next section, because all we're going to be taking a look at now is how to add some variation and maybe some smaller cracks kind of permeating through some of these cells, because it's pretty cool to have these larger shapes, but what happens if you want something a little bit more finite, right? A little bit more detail to these faces, as if some of the cracks have kind of offshoot some of these intersections here and kind of come into these larger faces. So really, to set that up, now that we know how to go ahead and set up cracks, it's really just a matter of kind of fine tuning some of the details here. So I'm going to hit Control D to duplicate this selection. And we're going to go ahead and just make a smaller version of pretty much the same exact thing here. So for our cells, I'm going to bring up our scale to maybe something like 6. I'm also going to bring up our Gaussian noise here, because if we take a look, right, because we're getting smaller detail, any waviness or warpiness is going to affect it at a larger scale. So we have to kind of bring the scale down while we bring down the size of the actual cracks. Now, obviously, there's no hard and fast rules, but generally that's probably what we're going to want to do. So we'll bring the scale from 13 maybe up to something like 16, right, just to get some more kind of waviness that's more fine-tuned to smaller cracks. And so if we take a look between these two, right, we've got some larger detail and some smaller detail. And let's go ahead and just blend this in together. So I'll add a blend node, plug this in here. And now what kind of blending mode are we going to want to use for these, right? because we can see that we've got this information up top and this info on the bottom. So how are we going to blend them together? Well, that's just kind of it. I don't want to blend these verbatim over top of each one of these cells because I want to kind of have a bit of control with how many cracks are showing up, what areas or what larger faces of the larger cracks we've got here are going to show up and where they're going to show up. And so I kind of want to give myself some leniency there. So what we can do is I'll bring our blend over here and I'm going to use the larger faces or the larger cracks to give an indication as to where, one, they're going to show up, and then two, kind of give us that range to work with here, that slider that I keep talking about. So if I go ahead and just plug this in to our opacity, now you can see that we've got our larger cracks showing up and we've got our smaller cracks showing up as well. But it's just kind of hard to tell because it's all everywhere and they're all kind of just the same size. And with this, I'm not really going to get a lot of flexibility to actually change which faces the small cracks are showing up on, right? So I'm going to create a little bit of a mini network here to really give us a good mask. And so we can see that we've got obviously very isolated faces. And if we are a little bit more familiar with Substance Designer, we know that the flood fill node is actually a really great node for getting or allowing us to isolate these different faces. So I'll add a flood fill node here, but we're not going to be done just yet because you can see this is actually exporting a bounding box. And obviously that's not going to work with our opacity because we need a grayscale image. So off of our flood fill, if I go ahead and start to type in flood fill again, you can see that the flood fill is actually a precursor node to a bunch of different other kind of flood fill tools or utilities. And now the one that I want to use is going to be flood fill to random grayscale. So now you can see if I plug this in, right, we're going to get kind of some areas that the cracks are showing up a little bit less, some areas where the cracks are showing up a little bit more. And this is going to be based on our grayscale that we've input into the opacity there. So we're almost there, but we need one more node to really give us the accessibility to just kind of bring a slider up and down and go, we want more cracks or we want less. And that node is going to be a histogram scan node. And the way a histogram scan is going to work if you're just uninitiated is that it's going to basically search through a gradient value, starting from a black value and then going through to a white value. So if we take a look, right, and I start to just kind of go through this position, we can see that we're getting different cracks at different times based on their value, we'll say, on a grayscale gradient from black to white. Now, what it's going to do is once it finds that pixel value, it's going to illuminate it as white. So it's actually not giving us the same color values or grayscale values of the input, but actually it's kind of denoting where along that histogram or that levels node, if we take a look at a levels, right? Where along this histogram is each one of these values. And once it reaches that, it's going to denote it as white because that's where the value lies. Now, that's not really important to know. I think it's just kind of some cool information that will probably help you better understand the node structures and the node networks and what is actually going on behind the scenes. But really, at the end of the day, all we need to worry about here is that this is going to allow us to sift through our histogram. And we're going to want to make sure that we bring the contrast up because now it's just going to be an on and off switch here. As you can see, I slide through. Some cracks are going to show up in some areas and some are not going to show up in others. And just like that, we've gone ahead and created a pretty robust mask. All right, so I kind of jumped the gun a little bit, but I get pretty excited with stuff that we can, use and set up to add a little bit of further extensibility. So let's now take a look at actually, making our large cracks large and our small cracks small. I'm going to come back into our edge detect for our large cracks here. And if we take a look, we have an edge width. So if I bring this up, right, we get just kind of thicker cracks there. And you can see it's actually updating our mask, which is really, really cool. And we also have a roundness option. So this is going to take some of those kind of sharper corners, if you can see, and kind of round everything out. Now it gets to a point where it's actually got negative returns. Now, if you're looking for something kind of like this, then it's awesome, but most times you're not really going to want to just round out everything entirely. So if we bring the edge width back down to around 1.7, and I'm going to take the roundness, and I'm also going to bring that down to about 3. I found that that's a pretty good kind of thickness here for just the edges, and then also the roundness for some of the cracks to make it look a little bit more organic and eroded once we get to actually developing kind of the inner crevices of these cracks. So now with that set up, let's go and do our smaller cracks here. And actually, you know what? I'll come back and make sure we have our blend selected there. And for our edge detect, I'm going to want to bring the width down just a little bit, right? Because these are technically smaller cracks. So I'm going to do 1.5 just to give them a little bit more snug. And I'm going to bring the roundness down to 0. We don't really need any roundness because they're so small really anyways. So any kind of roundness is just going to kind of blow things out of proportion there. Now that we've got that set up, we're starting to really get something that's resembling some cracks. But one thing that I'm noticing too is with our smaller cracks, it still looks pretty organic. If we take a look, you can see that where one crack kind of ends off one area, it starts on another. So I want to try and make this a little bit more organic and try and break up and randomize some of those rotations. So a node that's really great for that is going to be the directional warp. So on top of our small cracks, I'll go ahead and add a directional warp. And we're going to need an intensity input. Well, ideally what I want is I want to have different intensities for each one of these cells so that our cracks are going to stay within kind of the cells themselves, but just rotate at different intensities so that they're just a little bit off kilter with each other. And what's really cool is that we already kind of have a perfect texture for exactly that because we've got the cells still here. So these are going to rotate within these specific shell positions or cell positions. And we've got different values for the grayscale. So it means that each one of these are going to rotate once we actually input it and rotate it at different intensities. So I'll just shut up and actually show you what that's going to look like. So it's going to be a little bit tough to see, right? But we're going from this to this. And it's very, very minute. And actually, it's right there. It doesn't really change much. But here you can see it does change. And as we bring the rotation around, maybe I'll zoom out just a little bit so we get a better view. Right, you can see stuff is going to just rotate like that. But if I bring up the intensity to something like 50, we'll say, now you can see that, right, stuff isn't exactly lining up anymore. And if I can find some more, yeah, something like this, right, stuff isn't just quite perfectly aligned. Now, what we could do is if you wanted to, you could maybe add a blur to this as well to really push that kind of random intensity. But at the end of the day, if your cracks do line up, I guarantee you no one's even going to notice. So don't, go crazy trying to fix it. So I'm pretty satisfied with just kind of the sheer number of cracks we have. If you wanted to go ahead and add even more or, larger cracks or smaller cracks, well, we already know how to do that. And it's just kind of playing around with blending them together using all of the techniques that we've already learned. So now let's go ahead and actually make these look very crack-like they're kind of indented into the ground or the surface that they sit upon. So the first thing I want to do is I want to make sure that our normal map is, well, I'm going to force the alpha to 1, just it's better on my eyes. It doesn't really actually change any of the functionality. And I'm also going to set our intensity to 10. And you'll notice that it didn't actually do anything, right? And hopefully we're familiar with this, but because we've got pure white and pure black and no gradient in between, there's just too much contrast to really even show any normal map upon. Now you'll notice that if I bring the light across, you can kind of see it, but that's also being boosted from our ambient occlusion as well. So let's actually add some gradient information into these cracks so that it looks like there's, some more organic destruction to this and not just a black and white value. So after we've gone ahead and blended these together, I'm going to add a slope blur grayscale. And we'll bring this out and over. And this is going to be awesome for adding some of that micro detail to these edges. So if I go and drag this out, I'm going to use a fractal sum base. And if you've seen any of my videos before, you know that I also love this combination here. And we're going to have a bit of a problem, right? It's just too noisy. So in our slope blur, let's go ahead and bring the samples all the way up, crank them all the way, and let's bring that intensity way, way, way down so that it's actually something a little bit resembling what we once had. So I'm actually going to bring my intensity to about 0.5, and I'm going to change the mode from blur to be min. Now, we're not going to really notice what this does right now because we actually have to go ahead and I'm going to change our fractal sum base here. So if I bring our max level down to 10, well, now that's looking a little bit more agreeable, right? We're getting some of that larger destruction. It's not super noisy, but it's jarring enough. And we can also bring our min level up to 2 if we just want to kind of add a little bit more destruction. Really, that's at your discretion though. And actually, maybe I'll bring that down. Yeah, I like it better like that. So we've gone ahead and added some variation to kind of the edges of these cracks, but we haven't created anything in the middle. How are we going to do that? Well, there's another node that I really like because it kind of lets us extrapolate some information without having to really do much work. And that's going to be the bevel node. So I'll type in bevel, and I'm just going to shift click to steal this because oftentimes the bevel node doesn't know how to actually properly connect. And you can see that it's completely blown out our texture here, and it's kind of made it a little bit more difficult to see on our material or our mesh here. But you can see if we zoom in real close, right? That's really starting to look like a pretty good crack. So the bevel node has one option in particular that I'm really interested in playing with, and that's going to be the distance slider here. So as I bring that down, and actually I'll go to 0. And now I apologize if you already know how to use the bevel node, but I just want to explain it just to really understand what's going on. So if I go into the positives, you can see that the bevel information is actually going to go from the white value outwards towards the black. And it will go to an area where it actually reaches another brighter value, brighter than black. And that's when it's going to actually intersect a little bit. However, with the distance, I go back to 0, and then to negative, you can see that it's gone from these initial boundaries, and it's actually gradiated inwards. So you can kind of get this really cool erosion effect, and potentially a spoiler, I'm going to be taking a look at erosion effects in a totally different video, if it's not already out by the time you're watching this. But you can see very easily we've got a lot of surface information for really very little effort. So I'm going to bring this back up into the positives because I want the brighter values to reach out into each other, right? Into kind of the darker crevice area. So I'm going to do maybe something around 0.04. And it's going to give us this very, very bright value here. But now you can see that's given us a very, very cool cracked surface here. And now to just really sweeten the deal, I'm going to add another slope blur. And using this fractal sum again, just hitting Alt here to get this little cleanup tool. I'm going to make sure to crank up our samples, bring our intensity down to something like 0.04. I'll just zoom in here so we can see what's going on. And I'm going to switch the mode again to min so that we're getting some information. If I take a look, right, something a little smooth like that to something a little bit more organic and destroyed like that. Now, before we go ahead and close out this video, I just like to kind of recap what we've done and some of the extensibility that we can include with this particular material. Right, so back down here, we can see that this is where we've created our larger cracks. And now I can go ahead and play around with the disorder, right, to change some of the overall shapes of the larger cracks, and the smaller cracks are going to fill in there. We can do the exact same here with changing the scale or disorder of our smaller cracks. We can even maybe change some of the warpiness of the larger cracks here to something like 2, right, to give it an even more organic feel. And finally, I can go ahead and play around with our histogram scan here to change the position so that I can have more or less of these smaller cracks showing up on our surface here. Well, that's going to be our time together in this video. I want to thank you so much for checking it out, and I can't wait to see you in the next episode.